we should have just a very quick conversation here. I think the public and also, I hope, the speakers will have identified our intention, the way we have put the three first talks together. Starting, of course, with the framework questions, with Europe, the failure of Europe. Then going on very much to the way that radicalization with group identities, in the way they interact with each other or don't interact with each other, are perceived. And then I think it was important with you both to look outside of Europe, and at the same time come back to really understand more what we said yesterday. Of course, to look for a better life, the Judith Butler citat, I think, is a very good one, which we've been doing all the time. But to understand better the pull of the cities, I think, is one very important part, which is a broader debate, not just within recent migration, but it's also been one of the major things we see with the situation. We could also look at China now. So many countries, but also even in Europe, in the East German states, we have the same situation. People leaving, going to the cities, looking for different lifestyle, different opportunities. So we've tried to put the picture of what is kind of happening. My first question just here would be to ask, because there's so much we could talk about, before we ask for questions and comments. Is there a point which you amongst yourselves would either disagree with or like to pick on as to emphasize? That is one of the most important points we're looking at. I just ask and give you the microphone. Who would like to comment?
Yeah. Okay. For me, I think it was very interesting to have these three presentations together, and I think something that struck me was really how we're looking at migration and refugees at many different levels, and the way they're absolutely interconnected. We're looking at the European Union and states and borders. We're looking at urban deprivation, and we're looking at individual and collective aspirations and identities. So I think having this multiple scaled discussion is important. And I think on the point of cities as well, something that I'm finding quite interesting in these debates is when states are failing and when you have a crisis of politics, what role are cities as municipal actors going to be playing in this project? And I think in the international policy arena, they've not typically had a very strong voice. But if I just bring an example from Barcelona, for example, the city government is now trying to create partnerships with Athens to have refugees in Athens relocate to Barcelona. And of course, this is creating a lot of interest. This is raising a lot of interest, but it's also problematic because states have the jurisdiction over these issues as well. So how are we going to look ahead in the future with these different actors is something that interests me.
Comment on that?
Yes, well, that's indeed quite interesting, because what you see all over Europe is that it's cities that talk to each other much more than national governments talk to each other. National governments are very much occupied with the idea of how do we keep control? How do we make sure, as I said earlier, that the sovereignty is somehow kept intact? And therefore they're quite willing to implement all kinds of, I would say, nasty policies that are aimed at discouraging new arrivals. And actually coming up with all kinds of integration policies that actually force people to do all kinds of things that they would not normally want to do, or would normally do without the policymakers telling them to, that they actually are under an obligation to. Anyway, but what you see is that cities more or less have their own logic and think in very inclusive terms, like people are here and we don't really care too much what their legal status is, because we have to take care of them some way or another. And so they form coalitions that actually go beyond the national governments, and they also, that's interesting, they talk to Brussels, to the European Commission, to the European Union, which sees a way again to bypass the national sovereign in order to get the European project going, or to keep it going. So that's all very interesting.
There's another, if you give me this one back again.
Okay.
Just before I'll let you in the conversation in a second, I just remind, because our public knows, we had, and just to ask you again, we had Benjamin Barber here at the Karlsruhe Dialogues 2 years ago, when our theme was Democracies. And you know, Benjamin Barber is an American political scientist, and his thesis, of course, is if mayors ruled the world. He thinks that then they would get on a lot quicker than if it was the national politics. I just wanted to comment on that and then draw you into the conversation.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, for me, yes, there are very wonderful local examples where there are mayors and city elites and policymakers who are open-minded about integration of existing minorities, but also new groups who come and having faced all the struggles. But for me, the overarching dynamic is the consistent theme is that failure. There's a failure to integrate. There's a failure to incorporate, to accept, to value differences. And the terrain keeps changing, that the gap is narrowed generation upon generation. The them and us divide becomes tighter and tighter, and narrower and narrower. And I don't see there's much by way of solutions for this overarching paradigm. There are wonderful examples. There are great people everywhere. But the overarching dynamic is one of constraint, of inequality, deeply entrenched divisions, the 1%, etc., pulling ahead. And I don't think there's much to change any of this. The Panama Papers recently have exposed all sorts of deep problems in our financial systems and our elites. There are all sorts of other examples. And there's not much real hope. And I hate to be pessimistic, and I want to be optimistic, but I can't seem to find ways forward.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I completely agree with your analysis, but I really think we should look for solutions, and I think it's a moral obligation to be optimistic. But maybe you're right.
I think we should be looking at some solutions within the course of the day, but I would just like to keep on two aspects which we will be looking at. One is the question of aspirations and unfulfilled expectations, which you have shown, which I think is playing a huge role now also in Germany, where we have a lot of young refugees who are leaving again because their expectations were very different to what they have experienced in their first months of being here. And the other point, which I'd like to ask Tahir, because I think we will be looking at the question of decentralization within the cities, but also within the regions. I think the questions of communities and the interaction between communities within the cities is a huge challenge. I tend to be a little bit like you, that I think sometimes we have not always reason to be optimistic. One of the theses is, and we shall be looking also later at the role of the arts as one way of having people come together. But to get together, it has to be organized. I think we have been very idealistic, thinking people will meet at the marketplace and be inquisitive and get to know, but we see very different stories. I think especially in the UK, and as you know, I'm Scottish, also a migrant, and I know that the UK situation was a situation which is interesting, and that's why I'd like to ask you your opinion, of a state which defines itself as being multicultural. So it's not just the city, it is the state telling its citizens we are multicultural. And I would say it has failed, question mark, and comments? Do you like?
This is where we get peaks and troughs. There are times when multiculturalism is celebrated, that we value diversity and the difference is an asset, and that's actually verifiable. All the evidence will support the view that immigration adds to a net benefit to an economy over time, even if there are sunk welfare costs at the beginning. But at times of crisis, in the sense of the post-2008 Eurozone collapse, there is greater pressure on public finances, greater pressure on public spending, and the political context changes. So we find ways of problematizing the other, and the other is the most visible and exposed other at the moment, and they include the refugees, the refugee question, but obviously existing Muslim communities who were once migrants many years ago, but with second and third, fourth generations, experiencing all sorts of problems of disadvantage and exclusion. Creates anger and frustration, and it leads to the kind of problems we see in terms of people moving to Islamic State. Yes, there are great examples, there are some great policies, but it's all time-specific and situational. And multiculturalism is now equated with security. Difference is seen as a threat. And I think we need something dramatic to change that at the kind of macro level. At the local level, there are always some great examples. But what's interesting, without funding, without resources to facilitate those meetings in public spaces, none of this is going to happen just by pure will, even though there are good people everywhere, for sure.
I cannot but agree. But at the same time, being a student of policies for 2 or decades or so, I've grown skeptical about what actually policies in the sense of facilitating stuff really does. But I have noted that the way we speak about things, the rhetorics of politicians, for instance, is extremely important. If you have your great Chancellor Angela Merkel, who actually keeps repeating that the refugee crisis is not a crisis, it's simply people in need of protection and the Germans are going to help them. That's the type of story we should hear more often than we do. Whereas in my own country, in the Netherlands, we have a prime minister who always smiles, but says nothing of any substance. And he gets away with it. He's extremely popular, but by being completely empty. Because we can all see in him what we think we need, but there's no story there. Whereas I think in Scotland, and I had the privilege to do some fieldwork when I was a student in Scotland, it always struck me as a very open, a very kind type of society where, you know, it's okay being different and we're all migrants. Of course, many Scottish people have migrated and many Irish have moved to southern Scotland. So there's a whole history of migration out there. And not believing that your nation is the only true nation helps enormously. And if you go to Canada, sometimes you get sick and tired of being told that we should celebrate diversity. I mean, it can be too much. But in essence, you know, being reminded that diversity is simply part and parcel of society, and that's a good thing, it helps. I think we should have more of that.
I fully agree with all the comments, and I think a lot of this is sort of in an ideal scenario. We could really celebrate diversity, pursue aspirations on equal terms. I think the reality is very different, and I think the bigger overarching picture is more pessimistic than that, even if we keep the spaces and narratives of hope there. But I think this question of returning is very much related to also the failure of policies and the failure of recognition of this diversity and the positive aspects of diversity. And it's true that many people migrate and do not realize their aspirations and return. Some return of their own choice, others return, you know, feeling, because it's very often a family pressure to go abroad as well. And at least with the migrants that I've worked with, they don't often talk about the difficulties with their families at home when they go on Skype, and when they return home, they come with gifts and a sense of status. But it often hides a lot of the very strong difficulties that people face in their everyday lives abroad, and the isolation that they haven't been able to reach the aspirations or the goals that they might have set out with. So I think looking at that aspect of return is very important as well, and also linked to policies in the host societies as well.
Thank you very much. Und jetzt würde ich gerne das Gespräch öffnen und wie immer bitten um kurze Frage oder Kommentar.
Absolutely the case. Media and politics go hand in hand. And what we read in the newspapers or told by our television broadcasters is often highly loaded, highly subjective. Obviously, it's commercial too. It's to keep us in a state of fear in between advertisements for soap, etc. It is an industry, and therefore it's there to sell, and sensationalism sells. And as you well elaborated, once we get to know people, we share spaces, we understand that we're all human beings, we all have the same stories, the same journeys, the same struggles. And we don't get that from our illustrious media, sadly. I think Britain, we get the worst and the best of the media, but even the best isn't so good as it used to be.
Yeah,
no, well, again, I can only agree. But the media, but it's often too easy, I think, to blame the media. Because media, by their very function, of course, report incidents. And incidents is usually where it goes wrong. You don't report on where things go right, because that's boring, that's normal. So there's all these types of things to take into consideration. But I think the way the media in its functioning reflects diversity, for instance, that can help enormously. And I think in that sense the UK actually is a rather positive example. I mean, if I watch BBC, it's usually, you know, all people of clearly different ethnic backgrounds presenting stuff.
Presenting stuff, but it's behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, it's a very different picture. In fact, the BBC has been notoriously picked up for its lack of diversity. It's all well and fine having attractive ethnic minority figures in front of the camera, but those who make the decisions in terms of what's in the news is... But with the 24-hour news cycle, we have even more pressures on keeping people hooked to fear. And I think this is something very new to consider as well.
Mm-hmm. So I ask you to comment also, because I think one point which we can maybe also pick up on is, of course, the old classical question, what is not reported? And I think that is very different across space. I mean, even if you just go from BBC to CNN to ARD and ZDF, sometimes there are obviously some stories are being told everywhere, but especially with regard to reporting on Asia or reporting on Africa, there's not so much reported here in Germany as there is in UK or in CNN or whatever. Can you comment on that maybe as well as on the question?
I think it's a very good question, and I think if you've read the news over the past year or so, it has been about the Mediterranean, it has been about Europe, and it has been about refugees in Europe. And absolutely, this is a fundamental question. It is related to the rights of those who are on the move, but also at a political level, it's about European politicians asking questions about what is Europe. And I think this is very much highlighted in the media. But of course, as someone who has studied migration in Asia and in South America primarily, this is completely absent in the media coverage, in the international media coverage, apart from a couple of stories or a small phase last year during the summer when the Rohingya, the persecuted minority in Myanmar, was crossing to Southeast Asian countries. This is an ongoing crisis in the sense of an absence of protection of these groups, and it's happening on a very regular basis in the region. Also the border crossings from South America through Central America, Mexico, and to the US is covered sometimes, and especially in media outlets like, well, The Guardian, for example, will have stories on this sometimes, but in the UK, but I think there is an absence of recognizing the global story that we are living through in this particular moment of time.